How's it going, everyone? I hope you're having an awesome day. Welcome to the channel. I'm the ChainBaker, and in today's video I'll show you how to calculate individual ingredients for a certain size bread dough. Let's go to the kitchen and check it out. How to calculate the correct amount of dough and the correct amount of ingredients for that dough to fit a certain size baking tin has been quite a common question in the comments section. And today I will show you a formula which will work every single time. And it's not just about fitting a dough in a tin. This formula is universal. You can use it for calculating individual amount of ingredients for a certain amount of dough. But let's start with the tins. Most of baking tins come in standard sizes, in half a pound or 225 gram increments. From left to right, I have a 2 pound tin, 1.5 pound tin, 1 pound tin, and a half a pound tin. And that is 900 grams, 680 grams, 450 grams, and 225 grams respectively. Some of them have the weight stamped into the tin, but some of them are blank. And I'm sure we all have some tins at home whose sizes are a total mystery to us. And if you have such a tin, well, there is one way to find out what size it may be. Grab a pair of scales, place your tin on the scales, zero the scales out, and then fill the baking tin with water about 3/4 of the way up. I know this is a 1.5 pound tin because when I bought it, that's what it said on the label. And filling it 3/4 of the way up with water confirms it. 680 grams is 1.5 pounds. And with that out of the way, we can start with some calculations. And the first thing you need to understand is baker's percentage. I made a very long video about this a couple of years ago, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But the main thing you need to understand is that every ingredient is calculated as a percentage in relation to the total amount of flour. For these calculations to work accurately, the amount of flour is always considered as 100%. No matter if you're using 250 grams or 250 kilograms, it's always 100%. The water or the hydration depends on the recipe. It could be 50% or even less, and it can go up to 100% or even more. Yeast can be as little as 0.1% for a dough that's fermented for a really long time, but it can go up to about 1.4%. And this is instant yeast that I'm talking about. Active yeast and fresh yeast are used at different percentages, and I have separate videos on this too. When it comes to salt, it can be as little as 0% or no salt at all, and it goes up to about 2.5%. Any more than that would make the bread too salty. So the percentages of every other ingredient can vary massively, but the flour will always be 100%. And of course other bread doughs contain many other ingredients like eggs, butter and sugar, and we'll look at that a little bit later into the video. We'll start these calculations off with a very basic recipe. A bread dough made with 60% hydration, 1.2% yeast and 2% salt. This is a bog standard white loaf recipe. There is absolutely nothing special about it, it's as simple as it gets. I'll make for an easy understandable first example, so let's begin. Let's say I want to make a sandwich loaf to fit my 2 pound or 900 gram loaf tin. Because the dough is low hydration and it doesn't contain any enrichments, it will not puff up that much. So to fill the tin nicely, we will make the suggested 900 grams of dough. So we have decided how much dough we're going to make. We know that the flour is 100%, the water is 60%, the yeast is 1.2% and the salt is 2%. So the next thing we need to do is adding up these percentages. That's 100 plus 60 plus 1.2 plus 2 equals 163.2. That is the total number of percent in this dough between all the ingredients. Now we take our chosen amount of dough and divide it by this number. So 900 divided by 163.2 equals 5.51. Now what's this number and why do we need it? This number tells us that 1% of this dough weighs 5.51 grams. And you might get where this is going right now. We know how many percent of each ingredient there is. And we know that 1% weighs 5.51 grams. So all we need to do is start with the easiest one. The flour is 100%, so 100 times 5.51 is 551 grams of flour. That gives us the amount of flour in this dough. And we don't need to calculate each percentage with that 1% value, because as I mentioned earlier, every ingredient is calculated in relation to the total amount of flour. So for the water, 60% of 551 is about 330 grams. 551 times 0.6. The yeast, 551 times 0.012 equals 6.6 grams. And of course the salt is 2% of 551, which is 11 grams. You can of course multiply the 1% value with the individual percentage number of each ingredient. I've been calculating recipes for so long that I just find it easier to find out the amount of flour and then calculate every other ingredient in relation to it. And after adding up all the ingredients, the flour, water, the yeast and the salt, we ended up with about 898.6 grams. Now that's close enough to 900 for me. And of course you can round the numbers up or down a little bit. And this was a very simple example, so let's move on to something a little bit more complicated. This is a recipe for a dough which is made with eggs, butter and sugar. It'll be light and rise high, so we need to use less dough in this tin, otherwise it's going to be too big. So we'll go with 800 grams. So for this particular recipe, the flour is of course 100%, water 47%, yeast 1.5%, salt 2%, sugar 4%, butter 9% and 10% egg. If you add up all the percentages, the total percentage number is 173.5. And just as previously, we take the total amount of dough, which is 800 grams in this case, and divide it by the total number of percent. 800 divided by 173.5 is 4.61. So 1% of this dough weighs 4.61 grams. And the first ingredient we need to calculate, of course, is flour. 100 times 4.61 is 461 grams. That's the only ingredient you need to know. Now you can calculate all the other ingredients as a percentage in relation to it. So as you can see, no matter how many ingredients there are and what percentage values they have, the calculations are still the same. Adding these up, we end up with about 800.5 grams. You can find individual videos on my channel covering all these ingredients in this recipe. But of course, it's not always about fitting a loaf in a tin. Sometimes we may need to make a certain number of breads, which weigh a certain amount of grams. So we need to add another calculation on top, which is the number of breads times the amount that they weigh. Let's say 10 burger buns at 125 grams each equals 1250 grams of dough. Of course, the percentages are totally up to you. It's your recipe. Flour, water, yeast, salt, sugar, butter, and so on. The calculations are exactly the same as I showed earlier. I would highly suggest checking out the baker's percentage video on my channel. It also covers dough hydration. Now to help us visualize what we've done here, I have made the two doughs from the previous calculations. Now you might not be able to make this out, but this dough weighs 891 grams. That's because we lose a few grams during mixing and kneading. And that's why you should always weigh your dough before dividing it. Never assume that you can simply add up the amounts of ingredients and have that amount of dough, because it never works like that. You will always lose a few grams here or there. So if you want your rolls or breads to be the same size at the end, you should always weigh your dough before dividing it. By the way, in case you didn't know, every one of my videos is accompanied by a blog post or recipe on my website. You can find all the details there, and even things that I've missed in the video. And most importantly, you'll find the formulas there, which I'll show you in this video. You'll find a link for that in the video description. Okay, so our lean dough is ready for the oven. It's filled the tin up nicely. So in this case, following the suggested weight was the right thing to do. But we're not finished. We need to make another dough and compare it to the first one. This is the 800 gram dough, which contains the eggs, sugar and butter. You may be able to see this. We have lost about 7 grams of the dough, and I wish I could lose weight this easily. So the eggs, the sugar and the butter in this dough will make it puff up a lot more. But there's another ingredient that we're gonna add, which will bulk up the loaf just a little bit. It's a glaze. We are making a Dutch crunch loaf, and the glaze itself is close to 100 grams. It's not going to add too much volume to this dough. It's just worth considering. The main thing here are the enrichments. Do check out my egg comparison video after you watch this video. Eggs make a huge difference in the final loaf. Oh, and of course I'm not going to leave you hanging here. The recipe for this Dutch crunch bread will be posted in a couple of weeks. I will make an in-depth guide for this awesome loaf. And just like that, there it is. The crust is unbelievably crunchy and the interior is so soft. It's a great contrast and you should definitely try this bread out. But let's let it cool down. Let's compare these two side by side. And even though there's a 100 gram difference between the weight of the two doughs, they're more or less the same volume. And it's not really the glaze. It's just the fact that different ingredients and different recipes produce different results. And that's what you gotta keep in mind when you're trying to fit the loaf in the tin. If it's a low hydration lean dough, you should aim for more weight. If it's a light and rich dough, well then use less. But if it's a super heavy rye bread for instance, perhaps you should use more dough than suggested on the tin. I hope you found this useful and valuable. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here, subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.